This is Decision Making in ODRC by Sara Foster. Failures can lead to successes if evaluated appropriately. ODRC can use their failures in the past by looking at their recidivism rates and base their goals off of those recidivism rates. They currently have the mission statement of reduce recidivism among those we touch. This means that they are looking at recidivism as in felons that return to prison within 3 years of their incarceration. Access to resources such as housing is key to reducing recidivism. Recidivism rates are based on a lot of different things, but a lot of times felons who are released without housing have issues fitting into society, getting jobs, having any kind of support system or stability. So having a standardized housing process for offenders can greatly increase the risk of their success. Overview of ODRC. ODRC is the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. It's a state-run department in the state of Ohio. They have 28 different institutions throughout the state. 3 of those are privately ran, but they do offer support to the private ran institutions. The institutions run at several different levels. They go from a camp-like setting where they have access to even outside. They can go on like interviews and stuff from the camp, and people come in and help them with housing and provide all kinds of programming, up to high security institutions where they have very limited access to the outside and those resources. Housing issues. Housing issues for felons is difficult without a support system. As I mentioned, a lot of times felons find themselves in situations where they're not able to find housing, and it can lead to recidivism rates because of the instability and lack of support system. Halfway houses lack proper support for many struggling offenders. Consistent and all-inclusive housing programs need to be developed to reduce recidivism rates. Currently, the housing lies on case managers and offenders, and if there's some kind of standardized assessment for who can get housing and who's appropriate for what type of housing, and even a list of all the housing that's available that's standardized, it could greatly reduce the risk of them returning and in return reducing the recidivism rates for ODRC. The 7 strategies in doing this are decision analysis tools, expertise to bias your judgment, reason analogically, taking an outsider's view, understanding biases in others, and nudge people towards wiser and more ethical decisions. So these are the areas I'm going to be talking about more specifically in decision making of standardized housing at ODRC. The first one, prescriptive decision making procedures. Logic and analysis and how the housing decisions are made would benefit all offenders. Linear model could be used to calculate ideal housing for offenders. Type of offenses, barriers to change in behavior in prison, and physical location could be used on the linear model to determine what areas of housing that they kind of qualify for. This would kind of give some kind of standardized assessment of housing and what offenders are able to get. It definitely takes the guesswork out of housing, because housing is just too important for offenders to be guessing and not appropriately assessing their housing needs. Acquire expertise, strategic and required sharing of information among staff. This is important because there's a lot of expertise among the staff throughout the state that isn't really being shared. Competition for housing resources leads to competition. Housing needs are limited. Our housing is limited among for felons, so that leads to competition in case managers. They don't really want to share housing that accepts certain type of offenders because they're afraid it'll take away from the offenders that they're trying to get released, and they want to leave that space open for their own offenders, which in reality it's not anybody's offenders, it's offenders in general, and there's a collective goal of getting offenders released. High turnover rate leads to lack of expertise. Case manager is usually looked at as a stepping stone for a lot of people, so there's not a lot of time that's spent in that position, so expertise could be lower in that position. To bias your judgment, there are different steps in order to get rid of bias. Offer warnings about biases, describe the direction of bias, provide feedback about potential bias, offer training and coaching on biases, and offenders can face biases that lead to additional struggles with finding housing. A lot of biases focus on like different types of offenders and not really necessarily wanting to spend a lot of time with those offenders, and that can lead to housing issues. Reason analogically, comparative housing placement, looking at like how other offenders were able to find housing with similar barriers, simulative training scenarios, looking at displacing difficult offenders, identify how to address similar barriers among offenders, take an outsider's view, third party can lessen bias, outsiders can have an expertise that case managers are unable to achieve. Those outsiders would most likely be probation officers and are great partners for case managers. A lot of times probation officers are brought in anyways because they help look at potential housing, so I think that they would have a better idea of what is appropriate for what type of offender. Understand biases in others. Supervising bias can lead to overlooked issues, overconfidence in employee abilities. A lot of times supervisors will just assume their competent employees are making great choices and just kind of approve whatever. So standardized screening process that addresses case managers and supervisor bias is definitely a positive way to make sure offenders are getting appropriate housing. Nudge people toward wiser and more ethical decisions. Encourage staff to make ethical decisions. Support. Just giving them the tools that they need. Setting goals. No offender goes home homeless. And housing is a requirement, not a suggestion. So a big support from staff and leadership showing that housing is important and it's not something that can just be done quickly. Conclusion, creating a systematic approach to housing could decrease homelessness among felons. Training and accountability are key, and there should be a home for every release. Thank you.